live in a two-dimensional world. We won't go in one direction.
I don't think the console wars have ever been quite as heated as they were in gaming's 5th generation. I know, the Super Nintendo versus Sega Genesis was the console war, with the two neck and neck and constantly at each other's throats, and it really did feel like both companies truly couldn't stand one another. But with the 5th generation of consoles came Sony, who proved to be a wild card that threw everything into a frenzy, motivating both Sega and Nintendo to up their game and realize there were bigger things out there than just the two of them. The way Sony completely dominated the 5th and especially 6th generations of gaming is honestly still remarkable to this day. Sega, who had been Nintendo's first major competition in the industry since the 80s, was almost instantly demoted to also-ran status with the Saturn, thanks to both the PlayStation's massive runaway success and Sega's own brash and boneheaded business decisions. And so Nintendo was going to approach things a lot more carefully. Nintendo began work on a successor to the Super Famicom as far back as 1993, alongside PC hardware company Silicon Graphics, under the working title Project Reality. Officially announced in 1994, the console was initially called the Ultra Famicom in Japan and the Ultra 64 everywhere else. This would eventually be changed to simply the Nintendo 64 for all regions. And while many have speculated that this was to avoid trademark issues with Konami's Ultra games, Nintendo denied this, claiming that they simply wished to keep the branding consistent worldwide. The 64 was named in light of the console's 64-bit processor, which allowed for faster performance and higher polygon counts than its main rivals from Sony and Sega, both of which used 32-bit processors. Some N64 games would even support widescreen displays, which were not at all common for the time. Nintendo was moving on from the 16-bit Super NES and straight into 64-bit graphics with the N64, essentially skipping over a generation of hardware in an ostentatious attempt to outdo their rival console makers. This ultra-competitive sort of one-upmanship is what contributes to the 5th console generation feeling akin to a sort of video game space race, with tech rapidly evolving in any attempt to get a leg up. The N64 was even the first home console to feature 4 built-in controller ports, which was done largely to show off that the console could do native 4-player split-screen without any significant performance issues. While the public at first expected the Nintendo 64 to use CD-ROMs like the Saturn and PlayStation did, Nintendo decided to stick to standard cartridges, a decision that even at the time was considered bold and controversial. Cartridges had far more limited memory space than CDs, and were far more expensive to manufacture. CDs could hold about 10 times as much data and were about 10 times cheaper. But Nintendo was convinced that the minimal load times and built-in saves afforded by cartridge RAM were what gamers were used to, and thus what gamers would continue to prefer, as well as the simple fact that a cartridge could withstand more wear and tear than a CD could. Although one could also theorize that perhaps Nintendo was a bit embarrassed by the recent Sony-Philips fiasco, causing them to back away from CD-ROMs in shame. Plus, this meant Nintendo could continue to reap all the upfront licensing revenue of third-party developers by keeping exclusive manufacturing rights to the N64, the very issue that caused them to break contract with Sony in the first place. Nonetheless, the cartridge format meant that N64 games did run faster and smoother than those for both Saturn and PlayStation, which, combined with the console's higher bit count, is what Nintendo hoped would win people over in the end. Not to mention, cartridges were more difficult to pirate. While the console was finished in 1995 and planned for a Christmas '95 release date, it would be pushed back to mid-1996, as Nintendo was still working on getting sufficient software ready. This would put the N64 at least a good 18 months behind both the Saturn and the PlayStation, and indeed, Sony was able to take a pretty significant lead in the market during this time. To counteract this, Nintendo would change the N64's launch price from $250 to $199, a full $100 cheaper than the PlayStation, as well as run ads assuring people that the N64 would be worth the wait. The Nintendo 64 would finally release on June 23, 1996, coincidentally the 5th anniversary of rival Sega mascot Sonic the Hedgehog, with a North American release the following November. The console launched with only 2 games, Pilot Wing 64 and Super Mario 64. Cue all of our parents repeating some variation of Mario 64? I never even played Mario 63, like it was the most clever joke known to man. Nintendo of American chairman at the time, Howard Lincoln, attempted to justify this paltry lineup by assuring us that the company was focusing on quality over quantity. And in the second half of 1996, it really sucked to not be Nintendo. Initial shipments of 300,000 N64 units sold out on the first day, with the next batch of consoles that were shipping out 2 days later already reserved before they even hit shelves. The Nintendo 64 had a launch that was far more successful than even the PlayStation's, and the Saturn was basically reduced to a sobbing mess huddled in the corner. And alongside these massive sales came the tremendous critical success of what is, without exaggeration, the launch title that would define 3D game design to this very day: Super Mario 64.
It's me, Mario!
As the player begins a game of Super Mario 64, they're greeted with a wide-open courtyard, which serves to acclimate them to controlling Mario in a 3D space. Back in 1996, we had never really seen a game that played quite like this one. Mario has a full 360-degree range of movement, responding to the player's inputs in a very snappy manner, and he will even walk or run according to how much the player moves the control stick. The control stick was something of an innovation in and of itself. Other video game consoles were still using 4 or 8 directional D-pads, but here was essentially a miniature joystick built right into the controller that allowed for incredibly smooth and precise movement in any direction within a 3D space. To go along with this, Mario's moveset has been almost completely reinvented for the world of 3D. He still runs, he still jumps, but jumps can now be chained into a sequence of 3 increasingly higher leaps if the player times each jump one after the other. He can crouch to avoid certain attacks like in the 2D games, but here that crouch can also be used to crawl across the ground or slide downhill, or to set up a high-flying backflip, and a running long jump can be used to cross wide gaps. Mario can change direction on a dime, and this can be used to lead into backwards or side somersault jumps. Get enough momentum, and Mario can also perform wall jumps, and even chain them together between 2 walls to reach incredible heights. He's given a small selection of punches, kicks, grabs, and throws, as well as a jump kick and even a ground pound a la Yoshi's Island, meaning his combat options have been greatly expanded as well. The entire game is built around all these different abilities, and in fact, during development, the team placed priority on nailing down Mario's movement over designing the levels themselves. Once you're through the courtyard, you enter Princess Peach's castle, which acts as a recurring hub world throughout the game. Super Mario 64 forgoes the typical Mario obstacle courses, instead opting for more open-ended progression through wide, vast levels. Each of the game's 15 stages has 6 different objectives to complete to earn a star, as well as a 7th for collecting 100 coins in a single run. As you collect more stars, you unlock new areas of Peach's castle and thus new levels to explore, and the castle even has quite a few hidden mini-levels you can discover for additional secret stars. Of the total 120 stars, only 70 are required to finish the game, and with Mario 64 being somewhat open world, and each level having multiple different stars to collect, the player is able to pick and choose which objectives they want to clear or not. And all of that is presented with almost no load times thanks to the N64 using cartridges instead of CDs, which, let me tell you, is such a wild contrast after having just played Resident Evil, with its overabundance of loading door animations. With the new method of progression came a new damage model for Mario himself. Instead of the 2 strikes and you're out rule of the 2D Marios, here Mario has a full-blown health gauge segmented into 8 hit points. Mario will take damage according to the severity of each hit he takes, and given that the levels of Mario 64 tend to be built around verticality, Mario also takes fall damage when he drops from a great height. Seemingly taking a page from Sonic's handbook, coins indirectly act as a means to heal Mario's injuries, with the 3 differently colored coins recovering either 1, 3, or 5 hit points. Mario can also swim, and when underwater, his health gauge will double as his oxygen gauge. If Mario runs out of air, he loses a life, same as if he were to lose all his hit points. But should you ever find Mario running low on air, you can simply breach the surface of the water to instantly restore his entire gauge. Handy information to know as an alternate method for recovering from damage as well. All of these changes to the typical Mario formula almost feel necessary with the shift to full 3D gameplay. Those punches and kicks were included because the game designers no doubt realized how much trickier it is to aim your jumps in a wide-open 3D space. And the new non-linear progression and much more forgiving hit point system are no doubt the result of the game designers realizing that the traditional obstacle courses of 2D Mario would be a lot more frustrating from a 3D perspective. Landing on 3 consecutive enemies or platforms in a row without losing speed is something that can be done with just a tiny bit of practice in a 2D platformer, but in a 3D space they require much more patience and a lot of luck. So rather than forcing the player to make it safely through every corner of every level and avoid every hazard, the level designers instead present them with more segmented, bite-sized challenges that still leave the player with an immense feeling of freedom in terms of how they decide to engage with the game. Even the number and type of power-ups was greatly reworked from the previous games. Aside from the occasional Koopa shell you can ride for increased speed and immunity to enemies and floor hazards, the power-ups in Mario 64 all come in the form of hats. The wing cap acts similarly to the cape from Super Mario World, with the player gaining more speed and distance proportional to how steeply they dive. The metal cap grants Mario invincibility and protects him from toxins, as well as allowing him to sink underwater, but drastically reduces his jumping capabilities. Finally, the vanish cap allows Mario to walk through walls and other solid surfaces to take shortcuts or reach otherwise inaccessible areas, and makes him completely invisible to most enemies. In at least one instance, the game even has you use a metal and vanish cap at the same time. But despite how much they reinvented the formula here, the game doesn't bombard you with tutorials either. While the early hubs and levels are absolutely littered with signs that offer the player instructions or tips, that's all completely up to the player's discretion to seek out. The 3 Bowser stages are the only ones in the game that harken back to those traditional obstacle course style levels, and even they have a certain amount of verticality and built-in safety nets that make tricky platforming a lot more forgiving than one may expect. Really, the most old-school thing about Mario 64 is that it still uses 1-ups and game overs as rewards and punishments, but in the context of this game, I'm not sure I see the point of any of that. A game over just boots you back to the castle courtyard, and when you can save your progress after each star and visit each level in any order, that doesn't feel like much of a punishment. The 3D era of platformers marked the point in time when traditional extra lives really started to become an outdated relic. But in 1996, they were still so ingrained in the culture of game design that many developers seemingly felt obligated to keep them around. It was all any of us knew back then. The idea of a 3D Mario game first came about during the development of Star Fox all the way back in 1993, and was inspired by the Super FX chip Nintendo developed for Star Fox's 3D graphics effects. In fact, the interactive Mario head from Mario 64's title screen was essentially a leftover of a Nintendo tech demo from the 1993 Consumer Electronics Show. Miyamoto decided to wait for the N64 to bring the full game to life, if only because a new console would mean there would be more controller buttons with which to better control Mario's movement in 3D. When development began in earnest sometime in 1994, a group of around 20 people began by designing a game with an isometric viewpoint, similar to that seen in Super Mario RPG. Eventually, though, this would evolve into full free-roaming 3D, and much of the game's early development time was spent designing and refining the game's moving camera system. In Super Mario 64, the camera is presented diegetically as the character Lakitu, who is literally filming Mario, and by extension the player, on their quest to rescue the princess. In at least one instance, you can even see Lakitu's reflection in a mirror right behind Mario as he runs about the room. Thus, mechanically, the camera in Mario 64 can't move anywhere that Lakitu would be physically unable to go, such as through walls or under the floor. The controller's 4 C buttons, the C literally being short for camera, control Lakitu's current angle, but the camera doesn't move smoothly. It always moves in fixed increments in either direction. Pressing the up C button allows the player to scan Mario's surroundings from his point of view, the down C button will zoom the camera out a bit, and pressing the R button will switch to a behind-the-back camera view, for those instances where you just want to make sure Mario stays on a steady track. The camera system in Mario 64 is probably the element of the game that's aged the least gracefully. Obviously, there was a lot of trial and error involved here, as any point of reference for a fully controllable camera in a free-roaming 3D game quite simply didn't exist yet. Nintendo was essentially left to pioneer this stuff all on their own, and for that I can definitely give them a bit of a break. That being said, there are many moments in Mario 64 where it feels like the greatest obstacle I'm fighting against is the camera. A full 2/3 of the controller's face buttons are devoted solely to controlling the camera, and yet it always still feels like a struggle to keep Mario in frame where I need him. And the behind-the-back camera is both too slow to pan around and too close to Mario's back to be useful for anything longer than a few seconds at a time. Still, Nintendo made attempts to offset this by, again, prioritizing movement and overall feel over designing tricky level layouts. And one small way in which they compensated for the imperfect camera was by making sure every enemy, character, and interactable object would always have a shadow on the ground directly below them, even if this meant the lighting didn't make sense. Giving the player a solid sense of perspective and depth perception in a 3D space was more important to Nintendo than achieving any sense of realism. It's also a good thing that Mario 64 doesn't require you to collect every star to complete the game. Not only because the reward for getting all 120 is definitely not worth the trouble, but also because, if I'm being quite honest, all of the game's best levels were front-loaded to the beginning. Bob-omb Battlefield, Whomp's Fortress, Jolly Roger Bay, Cool Cool Mountain, Big Boo's Haunt, those are all instantly memorable and all-time classics. The castle's basement levels are all pretty great too, but it's when you start to venture into the upper floors that things get a lot less fun. Dire Dire Docks and Snowman's Land both just kind of feel like worse versions of Jolly Roger Bay and Cool Cool Mountain respectively, and Wet Dry World and Tiny Huge Island both revolve around specific gimmicks that affect their entire level layouts and make them pains to navigate. And while I actually kinda like how the hands in Tick-Tock Clock have variable speeds, both it and Rainbow Ride had me dying to the camera more often than anything in the levels themselves. With the exception of the first star in Dire Dire Docks, though, you can avoid all of the game's later levels if you get every single star before that point. But the way the game feels like it gradually loses its luster the further you go does mean that my casual replays never seem to go much further than the castle's first floor. It kinda makes me wonder what the game would have been like had Miyamoto's pie-eyed goal of 40 total levels actually made it to fruition. I mean, if Bane of My Existence Tiny Huge Island was considered good enough to make it to the table, how bad were some of the leftovers? I also have to wonder to what degree the game was held back by its cartridge format. The game's soundtrack is one of the greatest in the history of gaming, once again composed by Mario regular Koji Kondo, but it's also a very noticeably small list of tracks compared to other platformers of the era. 1996 was a long way off from the original Super Mario Bros. Having only 3 songs, and this game came out in a post-Mega Man and post-Sonic the Hedgehog landscape. Both of those franchises went out of their way to create unique tracks for each level, so why oh why did the big-budget AAA next-generation flagship Nintendo launch title think it was still okay to just recycle the same 6 music tracks for the whole game? More heartbreaking, though, is that there was an entire co-op mode planned that got cut due to design and technical issues, and that's basically the only reason Luigi is nowhere to be seen here. Mario 64 does feature some small bits of voice acting, though. Nintendo of America localizer Leslie Swan provides lines for Princess Peach, and yes, this was the first time the princess officially went by the name Peach in North America. And Mario 64 was also the first mainline Mario game to feature Charles Martinet's iconic Mario voice. While Martinet's first Mario game appearance was Mario Teaches Typing in 1994, and he had been the official voice of the character at live events and trade shows since as far back as 1991, Super Mario 64 was where most general audiences were introduced to his performance. Martinet would play a variety of roles throughout the Mario franchise in over 100 different titles over the course of 32 years, before retiring from the role in 2023. Looking back, it can perhaps be easy to think that maybe we were a bit too quick to put Mario 64 on a pedestal. With how much 3D gaming has evolved since 1996, a lot of us may say, why would the first attempt at a 3D platformer be the best one? There's so much we would do differently today. And that's why it can be hard to explain what exactly made Mario 64 work so well. Don't get me wrong, the game has its flaws for sure. There's the uncooperative camera, obviously. There's the way the hub world, while impressive, can feel kinda empty a lot of the time. There's the way that the small handful of real, strenuous platforming sections can feel pretty clunky and awkward. That's the thing, though. It seems like Nintendo kinda knew that they barely knew what they were doing. They didn't really know how to make a 3D platformer or how to make an unobtrusive 3D camera, but they did know how to make a character's movement feel fun at a core level. So they made the levels into skate parks. Playgrounds for the player to parkour around in with reckless abandon, and they tied it all together with an open sense of progression in the form of little mini-challenges. The stars are rewards for pulling off small, segmented objectives within the levels. Even the way the controls are just a little bit off, just a little bit messed up, contributes to the feeling of excitement you get when you finally pull off something cool. It truly is like skateboarding. The reason we feel so amazing when we do a series of neat tricks completely effortlessly is because we know that nothing about it was effortless. You only feel that high of accomplishment when you've actually accomplished something. And again, this is all such an evolution coming just off the heels of Resident Evil. These two games were released 3 months apart, and yet the way they each handle movement in a 3D space is quite literally nothing alike. Hell, Mario 64 is barely even the same genre as the 2D Mario games, and future games in the 3D collectathon genre couldn't seem to quite tap into what made Mario 64 feel so good at the end of the day. Other collectathons like Banjo-Kazooie and Donkey Kong 64 seem to come to the conclusion of Mario 64 was fun because it had you collect a bunch of things, but that was never really what made this game work. It's honestly still so impressive that Nintendo was able to pull off this sort of gameplay right out the gate. They didn't completely nail 3D level design, nor did they completely nail 3D camera work, but they absolutely did nail how a character should move in a 3D space. It's why the game focuses less on pure platforming challenges and more on exploration and experimentation and the feeling of joy that type of freedom brings. Nintendo, on their first attempt, laid the groundwork for not only 3D platformers to come, but the future of 3D gaming as a whole, once again proving that they truly were masters of their craft. Super Mario 64 would be the major contributing factor to the high early sales of the Nintendo 64, and would continue to entice purchases of the console through much of its lifespan. It sold over 2 million copies before the end of 1996, and that momentum would carry, as it would become the best-selling game on the N64 at nearly 6 million units. It was, needless to say, a massive hit both commercially and critically, and is the game many developers would look to as an example of fundamental 3D game design, influencing not only other platformers, such as Banjo-Kazooie, but inspiring games across unexpected genres, like GoldenEye 007, Tony Hawk's Pro Skater, and Kingdom Hearts. Seriously, the way fans and internet forums talked about Mario 64 back in the day, you'd think it was the cure to cancer. Its reach can be felt even today, with an absolutely massive and ridiculously dedicated speedrun community, very likely the largest and most popular in speedrunning history. But even with Mario 64's incredible legacy, and even with the incredibly successful launch of the N64, the console would fail to maintain that steam beyond its first year. While it sold more units in its first few weeks than both the Saturn and PlayStation did, those numbers would rapidly drop off. While sales held fairly strong in North America at 20 million total units, international sales only accounted for an additional 12 million, thus failing to meet sales expectations in both Europe and Japan. In fact, in Japan, the N64 took a very firm third place in the console race, falling behind even the Saturn, with Sega's console proving to be something of a surprise hit in the region. Now, there are several factors as to why this could have happened. For one, Nintendo's repeated delay of the N64's release put a sour taste in a lot of retailers' mouths. In sort of the opposite situation of the Saturn, where the surprise same-day launch threw a lot of stores into disarray, here, many store owners grew impatient and annoyed with Nintendo pushing back what was supposed to be a big holiday item. Another factor is in the N64 architecture itself. N64, quite famously, had a more powerful graphics processor than its rival consoles, capable of smoothly stretching textures over various polygon sizes thanks to trilinear filtering, without the crunchy pixelation of PlayStation or Saturn textures. While some preferred this, some others said it was a tacky technical trick that just made N64 games look like their screen had been slathered in Vaseline. The decision to stick to cartridges is also often cited as a major reason why Nintendo began to lose ground in the console race. CD's advantages are more apparent, whereas the few advantages cartridges have can be harder for developers to manifest. Yes, cartridges lack load times and can withstand more physical damage than CDs, but cartridges also took far longer to manufacture and were far more expensive. Developers making N64 games walked a tightrope of either having a surplus of a game that didn't sell or not having enough copies to meet demand. The high cost was also passed on to consumers, with N64 games being priced $10 or $20 higher than Saturn or PlayStation games. All of these factors combined resulted in third-party developers simply seeing CD-based games as far less of a risk. Nintendo also owned the cart manufacturing plant, and so would often prioritize their own games over those of other companies, further contributing to many third-party developers turning elsewhere. There's also the fact that 5th-gen games simply became too large and complex to fit on N64 carts anymore. The biggest Nintendo cartridges could hold 64 megabytes of memory. Meanwhile, CDs allowed for 650 megabytes, literally 10 times as much, and moreover, CD-based games could even be stretched across multiple discs if need be, multiplying that number infinitely more. While some argued that this meant N64 games were incentivized to avoid bloat or shallow spectacle in favor of more meaningful substance, it also meant N64 ports of PlayStation or Saturn games came with considerable compromises, namely fewer textures, shortened music tracks, and FMV being severely compressed. The console's lack of JRPGs was also cited as a major factor in why the N64 underperformed in Nintendo's homeland. RPGs, for better or for worse, pride themselves on having a lot of content. And while you can fit a lot into 64 megabytes if you really try, it was much easier and much cheaper to do so on a CD. Formerly Nintendo-loyal studios like Square and Enix jumped ship to PlayStation, publicly citing the limited storage of cartridges as the primary reason. Even with both franchises having built their legacies on the Famicom and Super Famicom, both Final Fantasy VII and Dragon Quest VII were released as PlayStation exclusives, despite both having early N64 builds made. Just the simple announcement that the next Dragon Quest game was being released on PlayStation caused stocks in both Sony and Enix to rise significantly. Konami similarly shifted much of their output to Sony, releasing twice as many games on PlayStation as the N64. And so, during the 5th generation, Nintendo had to survive mainly on the strength of their first-party IPs, with help from whatever second and third-party devs they still had around. Namely, Rare. Lots and lots of Rare. This all added up to mean that Nintendo 64 game releases were shockingly infrequent compared to the competition. By the end of its lifespan, the N64 saw a total of just 388 games, which was not only far fewer than previous Nintendo consoles — the Super Nintendo had seen almost 2,000, but also far fewer than its competitors. The Saturn saw over 1,000 total games, and PlayStation had almost 8,000. Nintendo's repeated quality over quantity mantra did have some merit, with games like Mario 64 and later Ocarina of Time being widely acclaimed and influential, but that approach unfortunately doesn't work when your biggest competitor has both quality and quantity. As time went on, people noticed that while the N64 was getting maybe 2 or 3 top-tier games a year, the PlayStation was getting a new killer app nearly every other week. Looking at the list of games I'll be covering on this channel, I have nearly a dozen PlayStation games coming up for 1996 and 1997 alone, but the next Nintendo 64 game I have on the docket won't be until 1998. And that just says something about how truly sparse this console's library was. Some game devs have also said that the N64 was quite difficult to develop for in the first place, and this likely also contributed to the limited release lineup. Even Mario 64's development was so strenuous that a few employees switched departments or even quit due to the stress. Statements from Nintendo near the end of the N64's lifespan seem to suggest that they held some level of regret over the console's inflated specs, expressing that being technically more advanced than the competition didn't matter if they couldn't keep up on software, a mindset that they would carry over into the future with more successful consoles such as the Wii and the Switch. The Nintendo 64's controller was also the target of some ridicule, even back in the day. It came in this unusual M shape with 3 different grips. In many ways, it wasn't that different from a Super NES controller. D-pad on one side, face buttons on the other, and 2 shoulder buttons. It was that middle part with the analog stick and the third shoulder button that threw people off. The N64 was the first console whose controller came native with a built-in joystick. Even the PlayStation wouldn't receive its dual analog sticks until 1998. But game devs, including Nintendo, knew that the industry wasn't going to abandon 2D entirely, and so they wanted to keep that D-pad around. In Nintendo's case, they figured they could design N64 games to use either the D-pad or the control stick, but never both, so the controller having 3 grips did make some sense in that context. It was an experiment resulting from those confusing early days of 3D gaming, and for that, a lot of us nowadays are willing to cut Nintendo some slack here. But at the time, particularly for those who played video games more casually, the sheer look of the N64's controller seemed ridiculous and indecipherable, like it was a controller designed by aliens.
Here's your controller, Grim.
Oh, I hate this stupid contraption. I can't even figure out how to hold this thing.
And it turns out, many N64 games would be fully 3D anyway, and so ironically, almost none of them even used that D-pad. The stubborn insistence on cartridges, combined with the console's downright strange controller, was largely received by the public as another instance of Nintendo's obsession with being different, while just expecting everyone else to put up with it and dance to their tune. It's an unfortunate turn of events. In years past, with consoles like the Game Boy and Super NES, Nintendo's late-to-the-game, almost countercultural approach to console design meant they were able to take note of where competitors tripped up and address those issues with their own consoles. They tried this again with the N64, but what they hadn't expected was that consumers would largely prefer what their competitors were doing. There's also the simple fact that the overall landscape of gaming was rapidly changing in the wake of Sega and Sony. What was once seen as a novelty pastime for kids was quickly growing into a dedicated hobby for many young adults. Advertisements for games and consoles were becoming more edgy, and games themselves were growing more complex by the day. The PlayStation and Saturn both aimed at these teens and young adults, whereas Nintendo games continued to skew younger towards kids and preteens. Stuff like Mario and Donkey Kong, those were just for casuals. Everybody knew the real gamers were playing Resident Evil and Tomb Raider. This unfortunately created a sort of class warfare within the gaming community, with many adopters of PlayStation looking down their noses with disgust at the N64, decrying it as a product for little kids that they had proudly outgrown. Where Sony and Sega went with simple grays or blacks for their machines, the N64 came in multiple colors. While some appreciated having these options, since it made their consoles feel more personalized, others felt that this only supported the argument that the console was a toy for young children, and only made it that much harder to take seriously as a piece of hardware. This not-so-gradual trend toward more mature gaming permeated through both the N64's look and library. The severe lack of RPGs would really hurt the N64, and not just in Japan. For whatever reason, Nintendo almost seemed to intentionally steer away from RPGs during the N64 era. Outside of Pokemon, of course, it seems like they believed the genre to be generally too complex for their target audience. And this ended up hurting them in the long run, since this decision happened to coincide with the mid-90s RPG boom that would dominate the gaming scene for at least through the next console generation. Essentially, once Final Fantasy VII came out, it was all over for the N64. Thus, the N64 would be seen in its day as something you'd whip out at small parties or get-togethers as an activity friends can all play together to kill an hour or two. It wasn't really seen as a product made for serious single-player gaming experiences. Despite it all, though, the Nintendo 64 still saw host to what are undeniably some of the greatest and most critically acclaimed games of all time. The console itself may have undersold the PlayStation by a margin of 3-1, but Mario 64 alone became the highest-selling video game of the 5th generation, outperforming even the PlayStation's two top sellers, Gran Turismo and Final Fantasy VII. It would take until 2002 for another video game to break Mario 64's sales records, Grand Theft Auto Vice City. And Mario 64 managed all that even before it was re-released a half-dozen times. The N64 also eventually saw the return of the Zelda franchise with Ocarina of Time, which to this day still holds the highest average review score for any video game in history, with Super Mario 64 not that far behind. And some would argue that that's really what matters at the end of the day. Not sales or profit margins, but rather the cultural impact and legacy left behind. The fact that the N64 received some of the most influential, revolutionary, and timeless games in the history of the medium is precisely why the console has managed to retain its staying power within the cultural consciousness. The N64, in defiance of all the hardship it endured, is nonetheless considered a classic and a fan-favorite Nintendo console for many people. Even with its shrunken selection of games, it's still commonly seen as one of the greatest consoles ever made. PlayStation may have been the cool new kid on the block, but perhaps it was the N64 that truly won the console war in our hearts.